Hi everybody, welcome to IndyCar on the 2nd of May 2019. I'm Gordon Ross. In today's news, I'll be looking at the story that is being carried on the front pages of the newspapers this morning, and that's the story of Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson, who's been sacked by Theresa May as Defence Secretary over alleged leaks concerning the government's decision to allow Chinese company Huawei to be involved in contracts for the UK's new 5G communications network. Also later in this edition, I'll be also talking about another big milestone in the UK's broadsheet media today. In the Financial Times, an article which claims that Scotland now has to become independent as a result of England's decision to leave the EU. We'll come back to that story in a little while. But first, back to the story that is taking up hours of time on BBC and ITV news networks this morning. The story of Gavin Williamson's sensational sacking by Theresa May after this leak from an internal committee, basically a security committee of the UK government. Now, in the past, secret decisions or conversations between the Secret Service and the government would have been subject to the Official Secrets Act, and that would have meant that if someone had leaked important information about security or decisions concerning security to the press, that would usually be not only a sacking offence but would involve a police investigation, because such revelations would almost be the basis of a treason charge. Certainly would be a major scandal in the UK's heart, the heart of the UK's political system, and in the heart of its security decision making. Now, it's alleged, and I'm saying it's alleged, that Huawei, which is a company which is partly owned by the Chinese government, but Huawei is the biggest mobile phone manufacturer in the subcontinent, in China itself, and they have a very good reputation for the quality and standard of their technology. But there is a lingering suspicion, mostly I would say articulated by the Americans and the Australians, that in somehow or other the Chinese company Huawei might have embedded some kind of spying software or hardware even into the design of its 5G systems, and therefore shouldn't be allowed to tender for contracts for 5G networks in the West. Now, if you put that aside for a moment and I just talk about what's been said there isn't any evidence yet that supports this theory that Huawei is in some way connected to the Chinese Secret Service, and they are somehow or other involved in planting espionage devices in the 5G network. However, it's not to say that the 5G network is going to be all that secure. Remember that the 5G network is not just a mobile phone service. The 5G network will link up the Internet of Things. Now, the Internet of Things could be anything from a nuclear power station to a tea kettle, and all of those things could be controlled via the Internet through this 5G, so-called 5G system. So there is the scope for technical espionage to take place, but only if the Secret Service and the electronic specialists at the Secret Service of the UK were not to do their job. Now, the UK's technical Secret Service, and that's GCHQ, by the way, they monitor all kinds of electronic communications. They have ways of intercepting and analysing and looking into software issues that might be things like malware or spyware. These are software algorithms which are designed to collect information and pass it to a third party. They can find that sort of stuff already, so technically the defence against any spyware from Huawei is already in place, and therefore it might be that Huawei is actually a perfectly safe organisation. And you could argue actually that having a mixture of Western hardware and Chinese hardware in 5G systems, if it were reciprocated in China, would allow everybody to spy on everybody else, and that would actually, in theory, make things safer if everybody knew everything that everyone else knew. Anyway, Coming back to the story of Gavin Williamson, there was a leak, and the leak was that the British government had decided to award some of its contracts for its 5G network to Huawei, and that story was leaked to a major newspaper by somebody in the room, or somebody who was listening to what was being said in the room. Now, why would they leak this information to the press? The obvious reason is that somebody knew why Huawei was being given this contract. There have been reports, and I can't substantiate them at the moment, but there's at least one report circulating on the internet at the moment which claims that 3 former Tory cabinet ministers belonging to David Cameron's previous Conservative government are actually on the board of directors of Huawei UK. So that's the UK arm of the Huawei Corporation here in the United Kingdom. So that would mean that 3 former Tory government officials are now in positions of high authority in Huawei in the UK. And should Huawei be given these lucrative contracts throughout the UK 5G network, these 3 former Tory ministers, who are obviously still members of the Conservative Party, stand to make a fortune. So it becomes kind of obvious why the Tory government might want Huawei to be involved in the 5G network when you know that Tories are on the board of directors of Huawei UK. Now, whoever made the leak was obviously concerned that this piece of information about why Huawei might be invited to take part in the 5G network here was more important than the actual information itself. It was why the Tory government decided to allow Huawei in when the Americans quite clearly were deeply suspicious and were advising everybody not to have anything to do with Huawei. The British government has chosen to let them in primarily because, according to these stories that are circulating on social media, because 3 Tories are on the board of directors of Huawei UK. Wouldn't be the first time that a major contract for billions of pounds worth of infrastructure was somehow magically awarded to a company that was full of either Tory donors, Tory members, or Tory politicians who had directorships. Not unusual at all. Very corrupt, and whoever actually leaked the document to the press was obviously hoping that the press would dig a bit deeper and rather than just blaming somebody for leaking it, would actually look at why the UK wanted Huawei in the first place to be doing this. And it seems, well, kind of obvious really, if 3 Tories are actually on the board of Huawei UK, it's very obvious that it's corruption. That's Tories making money for Tories by awarding government contracts to other Tories. Very simple piece of corruption, very commonplace in high echelons of establishment power in the UK and in other countries as well. So Gavin Williamson has been selected, obviously, to fall on his sword, to be the sacrificial lamb, to take the media attention away from the reason for the leak and onto the person supposedly responsible for it. Now, I don't actually believe that Gavin Williamson is guilty of making this leak. I think it's been made by somebody else, and it's been leaked on purpose to embarrass the government, who are plainly involved in some corruption here, passing lucrative contracts to other well-established Tory ex-politicians who are on the board of directors. So it looks like, on the face value, on the face of it, and bear in mind I haven't verified the stories about these 3 potential directors at the moment and whether they are in fact who it is alleged they are. So we're looking at this at the moment to see if there are 3 Tories on this board of directors. But if there are, then it's a clear case of corruption. Okay, so let's leave that aside for the moment and move back to Scotland and the dawning of realisation in England, and particularly in the English media, that Scotland now has to become independent, doesn't really have a choice anymore. And where else, I mean, where else would you not expect to read about this but in the Financial Times, the most London of London newspapers and one of the most conservative publications in the United Kingdom. And they ran an article today where their columnist was basically saying that because the English government had relentlessly pursued Brexit, despite knowing that the Scottish people had voted overwhelmingly to reject Brexit. Because they'd done that, and because they then ignored the Scots basically complaining that this was not what they had voted for, and this was not why they had stayed in the UK, the British government instead chose to focus all its attention on the effects of Brexit on Northern Ireland, which is only 600,000 people living there, is a far smaller issue, if you like, than the whole of Scotland deciding to leave the UK. But instead, Mrs May took her eye off the main issue, which was keeping Scotland in the UK. Instead of that, she started to focus on the backstop in Northern Ireland, completely ignoring the Scots' complaints that they were being sidelined and that the whole population had voted against Brexit and there was no way we were going to leave. So now we're in the process of leaving. Brexit is now virtually a done deal. The Tories are locked in a smoke-filled room with the Labour Party, trying to thrash out a way in which to get the bill through the Commons before the 22nd of May to avoid the EU elections. Now, if this all goes ahead, the author of this article says that Scotland really has no choice now but to become independent, because the only way to save its balance of payments, its export orders, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of jobs that would be lost through this stupidity, not to mention the loss of European workers coming in and out of Scotland who are essential to the Scottish economy. Scotland really has no choice other than to make itself independent and return to Europe and to keep its connections with Europe in a way that suits the Scottish economy. And for an English financial newspaper to make the case for Scottish independence in this way is unprecedented. In the past, they would have lambasted Scotland for not being able to stand on its own 2 feet and having far too many financial problems to be able to make it work. Now they're admitting that we have to do it, and also saying it's a political imperative and an economic imperative that Scotland now becomes independent, because England has forced Scotland to separate from the United Kingdom by its own actions. And the author of this article blames Mrs May and the fact that she has ignored Scotland and instead chosen to focus her attention on Northern Ireland and doing a deal with the DUP, bribing the DUP with billions of pounds worth of taxpayers' money, and all the while ignoring Scottish calls to halt Brexit. So this is the second major article that I've seen in the UK press south of the border, which now raises the serious prospect of Scotland needing independence, not just wanting it, but having to take action to preserve its economy from Brexit damage. Basically, the Financial Times has made the economic case for independence to its English audience. And that's the first time I think we've ever seen that happen with a British newspaper. Some might say it's trying to force the SNP to move too quickly, but the article itself says, and it's a little bit watered down at the end, and it does say that they feel that the timescale of sometime in 2021 is too soon for the Scots to become independent. But then I think, well, this is the Financial Times, they would say that, wouldn't they? They don't want the prospect of independence brought closer in time. They want it further away, so they have time, or so the British government has time to fudge it and find a way around it. But it seems that the pressure is mounting south of the border now for England to release its grip on Scotland and allow the Scots to have their vote and to separate from the UK in a peaceful, orderly manner, so that both countries can sign some kind of new trade deal with each other, so that they could continue to trade after England has left the European Union, and while Scotland either still remains or is tied to the European Union in some other form, such as a free trade agreement. But the fact that it's dawning on English journalists that Scotland is really going to leave, I think is the first time they've actually woken up and thought, my God, Scotland really is going to go this time. And there's not much that England can do to stop them, because it is England which is pushing Scotland out of the Union, not the other way around this time. Anyway, that's about it from me for today. I will be on your screens again tonight on Broadcasting Scotland. I'll be hosting Scotland at 7 this evening. you can tune in via YouTube, or you can see us on live stream. So whichever way you like, the Scotland at 7 is on tonight, 7 p.m. If you miss it, don't worry, you can catch up on the archive on YouTube, or you may also be able to find it if one of my friends decides to post it on my Gordon Ross IndyCar account later on tonight. That's it for today. So basically the Financial Times is now making the case for independence for Scotland, and the English government is basically at the moment trying to kid us on that this leak about the Huawei 5G deal is somehow Gavin Williamson's fault. I don't think it is. I think somebody has leaked the documents to try and expose the corruption at the heart of this deal, which seems to be that three men who were prominent Tory ministers in David Cameron's government are now the directors of Huawei UK, and that means that those three men would make a fortune out of getting these deals from Mrs May's government. That's about it for today. See you all tonight on Scotland at 7. Have a great day. Bye bye.